bright colored infographic to get people engaged. And I think it is drawing more and more, not just general public, but scientists to publications. So I think that's a great tool. And then Mead touched on something about working with Alaska, working with communities, indigenous communities. And she also mentioned the need to know your audience. We have, as probably no surprise to any of you, been experiencing dramatic changes in Alaska. The water's been warming. We are seeing declines in sea ice, and that's changing the ecosystem in the Bering Sea in particular, where we used to have really two structured ecosystems. The southern Bering Sea, which was where all the big commercial fisheries are operating for pollock and cod, and the northern Bering Sea, where we've got more of a subsistence culture, dependent on the sea ice for hunting ice seals, harvesting whales, and that's dramatically changing. In the last few years, the sea ice has been declining at a much more rapid pace. It's not sticking around. So typically when the sea ice comes down in the wintertime, it sticks around into the spring, and it creates this sort of natural barrier between the north and the south in the Bering Sea. And the pollock and the cod don't really like that. Well, the sea ice, they can't move, but when the ice dissipates and leaves, it leaves a cold pool behind. And that water's temperature is typically colder than these species like to go into for long periods of time. And there's always been this large footprint. So it's created, like I said, a natural barrier between the north and south. And with less sea ice, that barrier is smaller. And so the fish are migrating north. And so the ecosystems are mixing. And the communities up there are seeing these dramatic changes. And we're up there doing surveys, and we're trying to explain why we're doing them. And when we're presenting our information, we have our mission as a federal agency about what we're supposed to be up there doing. We're supposed to be looking at the pollock and the cod and other species that are federally managed so that we can have accurate stock assessments. But the communities up there, they want to know what's happening to the species that they're used to eating. This is subsistence foods. They eat tunicates, surprisingly. And because we're sampling the bottom, we're collecting a lot of information on tunicates. So when we go in to make a presentation to these communities, we're leading with what they want to know, what's of interest to them. We're sharing with them information on what we're seeing happening with the tunicate population, as well as the information that we think we should be sharing with them about what's happening with these commercial fish stocks. And so knowing your audience is really important. It's a great way to engage them. It's hopefully starting this really good relationship where we're sharing information and maybe moving towards this idea of co-production, where maybe we'll be doing some research projects together, coming to the table, designing those projects together, and then implementing them. And so that's a large part of what we're doing. There's a lot more to our comms program. We're trying to do things with school groups and get kids engaged at a young age. We're trying to improve diversity in our workforce. And so we're trying to do targeted outreach to some of those Alaska Native schools, because our big constituent group in Alaska is the Native community. And we'd love to see more people in our workforce. But we have to start working with these kids at a young age to get them engaged. And so we've got educational programs at the center that we're involved in from K through 12 and college. And I can talk more about any of those if you're interested in hearing it. I think I'll leave it there.
Terrific. Thank you so much. For those of you who are just now joining us on Zoom, welcome. This is our Conversations in Environmental Communication series, the program on the environment. My name is Sean McDonald. I got three great guests here today: Mead Crosby, Marjorie Maggie Mooneysus, and Jim Wharton. I should mention that it took me a while, but I finally figured out YouTube. I am not a technical wizard, but we are broadcasting live now. If you have questions and you're joining us on YouTube, please type them in into the chat in YouTube, and we'll make sure that we answer those questions in due time. But before we go on to our Q&A, I do want to give Jim Wharton a chance to introduce himself and to give us his thoughts. Jim.
Thanks, Sean. I'm Jim Wharton. For those who are just joining us on YouTube, I'm the Director of Conservation Engagement and Learning at the Seattle Aquarium. I use he, him pronouns. I've been in the field for about 25 years, started at the Oregon Coast Aquarium. I've also worked at the Smithsonian at the Mote Marine Laboratory before coming to Seattle. really interested in sort of this intersection of scientific knowledge and public interest in conservation, and particularly the different ways that we can communicate and engage with our publics. In my sort of spare time, I do a lot of shark conservation advocacy. It's actually not my spare time, actually. It's also something I do with the aquarium as well, and with the Association of Zoos and Aquariums. Really like to think about the different ways that we engage with public and science, whether that's through science cafes or lightning talks, or more and more of these sort of video enabled virtual presentations as well. Seattle Aquarium's a conservation organization, so our mission is inspiring conservation of our marine environment. And we feel like that we're a really, really appropriate place to work on ocean conservation issues, because in the end, conservation is not really about, it's not just about animals and habitats. It's really about people, because people are both the problem and the solution. So what better place than an aquarium where people and animals and habitats all come together to be able to sort of celebrate and motivate people to adopt conservation solutions, and really to co-create them together. I loved hearing that theme from both Maggie and Mead, because it's a direction that a lot of our work has gone as well. I think traditionally, sometimes we've thought of scientists as having that expertise and bringing that value. And it is a value that you bring to conversations, but it shouldn't be a lever of authority. It should be something that you bring to the table that you can share with your audiences and be able to build these things together. I think when we think about the work that we do at the aquarium, the scientific basis of what we do is absolutely critical, but it's not just the biological sciences or the physical sciences, it's the social sciences that become really important with the work that we're doing. And so we've had a big concentration on empathy. What is the role of empathy in inspiring conservation? How do we merge together ideas of empathy and diversity to help people see themselves as part of a greater whole and feeling a responsibility to take action? We've also been thinking about how we bring values to the conversation, how we share our values for the environment, and how we listen to and hear and meet people where they are with their values for the environment. Because not everybody's going to value the ocean in the same way, but we all benefit from a healthy ocean and suffer from a sick one. So can we find shared spaces where those values overlap and we can get to common ground? And so we're doing a lot of thinking along these lines. We recently have been turning some of our conservation work towards thinking about how we can foster an ocean ethic in our communities as a way to help, again, inspire that activity, that conservation movement. So it's not so much a rules and regulation kind of movement, whereas thou shalt do this and thou shalt not do that, but it's something that people feel is important, and they feel responsible because they understand their sort of interconnected position within that system, and understand that they need to take care of their life support system, a system that they're part of, and not something that they sit outside of and observe. So it's been an interesting transition from, when I started in the field, I just had a lot of cool stuff I wanted to teach people about the ocean and about sharks and stuff, but seeing how our field and my role within it has changed over the years has been pretty fascinating. So excited to talk about it.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jim. So for those of you who are just joining us now on YouTube, my guest today, Mead Crosby, Senior Scientist, Climate Impacts Group at the University of Washington, Marjorie Maggie Munisus, Communications Program Manager at NOAA, Alaska Fisheries Science Center, and Jim Wharton, Director of Conservation Engagement and Learning at the Seattle Aquarium. This is the time during our program where we turn things over to you all to ask your questions. Students, staff, faculty that are online, if you'd like to ask your questions in the Zoom, raise your digital hand and we'll call on you. If you're on YouTube, you can go ahead and chat your questions to us and we will ask those of our panelists. Let's go ahead and get started with Joash. Do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
I totally do. Can you guys hear me okay?
Right
okay,
on.
wonderful. Yeah, so my question is directed towards Jim. So you're talking about this idea of developing empathy, and you reference empathy as a skill, especially in your conversation with Anita Nowak.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm interested, how are you developing the skill of empathy in an equitable way within the Seattle community? That way you're reaching all those populations that you're servicing.
So that's a good question. And that's an interesting combination there. I think that there is often a criticism of empathy in that it focuses people's attention on the things that they have in common. And that's really important when you're thinking about something like a barnacle or a sea star, where it's not as evident as how much we have in common. But when you're looking at especially when we're thinking about how we have empathy for people, sometimes that overemphasis on the things that we have in common creates a divide between those things that are most like us and those animals, organisms, or people who are less like us. And so I think that's an important distinction to be made. And it's one that we try to surface and talk about in a metacognitive way. What we try to do to alleviate that is to always pair a discussion of empathy with a discussion of diversity. Because if empathy is sort of the conversation that connects us and helps us see our connections to other living things, then diversity is the conversation that helps complete us. And so it helps us understand where our place is in that sort of interconnected whole, because otherwise it just becomes about us. It just becomes about, how am I like this thing? How am I different than that thing? As opposed to, where do I fit into this larger whole? So I think when we pair those two conversations together, I think that the discussion is much stronger. And diversity, whether you're talking about biological diversity, or you're talking about, the diversity that we talk about every day, all of these things strengthen systems. And so unifying those conversations, I think, is the way to try to make that conversation as equitable as possible.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jim, for that. Students, feel free to ask additional questions either in the chat or raise your hands and ask the questions aloud. Oh, Maya, please go ahead.
Hi, yeah. I have a question for Mead. I read your op-ed piece in the Seattle Times about how to positively spin the topic of climate change. And in it, you discuss how giving these devastating prognoses are so common. And so my question is when examining like the elements and the impacts of climate change, like what are your key strategies for translating such complicated scientific jargon into understandable and a positive translation for the public? And more specifically, what types of sources do you use to get that information and inform your judgment? If that makes sense.
So actually the group that I work with, the Climate Impacts Group, we do a lot of different things, but one of the things that we do is generate that kind of regional climate information that makes it really easy to see the connection between this big global problem and how it's actually going to affect us here where we live and the things that we care about. So as part of that work, we generate a lot of kind of more layman-friendly summaries of climate impacts for decision makers and policymakers that really succinctly lay out the kinds of information that you would want to convey very clearly and simply to the public. There's also, so for regional impacts, I actually rely heavily on our own work at the Climate Impacts Group for getting those sound bites of like the things that are expected to happen and what's already happening. More globally, I looked at the IPCC, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. They produce a lot of the really foundational assessments of how things have been changing and how they're expected to change. And those reports also have a lot of the really useful sound bites on like what are the key impacts and why is this important. And then when thinking about how to communicate this to people, I think, again, the thing that we are not trained to do as scientists that is incredibly important to do when communicating to the public is de-jargonizing and de-caveating. So basically scientists we're always worried about, we're trained to be primarily concerned about our credibility. And so we never want to overstate, we never want to be too certain. And so the way that we communicate to other scientists is just full of like, caveat, but. When you speak to the public, you don't want to, it's not that you're trying to erase that uncertainty or trying to erase the things that we're still figuring out, but there's a lot that we can say. Like we can say it's gotten warmer. We can say it's, under these different carbon emission scenarios, it's going to get this much warmer or this much warmer, within some range, but like it's going to get warmer. And so when you're speaking to the public, it's about digesting, all of this information into what we can very clearly say. And then also thinking about the how certain words have different meanings to the public than the science, like uncertainty. So uncertainty to the public means like we don't really know. Whereas for scientists, it's actually there's a range, and we're talking about this range of potential futures. So there's that. And then as far as like the positive spin, I think for me, it's more about not making any of the things that are very challenging pieces of information about what's happening and what will happen in the future in terms of what it means for us. I'm not trying to put a positive spin on it, like it's going to be great if it gets 6 degrees Celsius warmer. That's not what I'm trying to do. What I try to do is when you deliver that information, which is very difficult information to hear because of what it means to everything that we care about, that you never deliver that information without also saying what we can do about it, and that the things that we do will make a difference. And so that's the positive spin, is that those futures are not here yet and they can be changed, and here's how. So that is the message that I always want to pair with the difficult information.
Yeah, and actually, Maggie, I was going to ask you a question about that, but please go ahead.
Yeah, I kind of just want to build on what Mead said. I think, I think that's really important. You always want to leave people with, well, it's not just doom and gloom. Here's what you can do, or here's what we can do to look at the future and help you prepare. And maybe sometimes it's about adapting, because there's maybe something that we're not going to be able to reverse or address. So we're going to have to adapt. But giving people the tools to help them prepare for these changes is really important. And I do think I think the overarching message is about change, and a lot of that change is negative. There are some positives too, of some things, that some animals that are doing better in warmer temperature than other animals. And so I think you want to, if you have any of those kind of messages, you want to be able to get those across to people too. But I think the key message the key take home is making sure you leave people with something that you can empower them so they don't feel overwhelmed by what you're presenting.
And Sean, if I could jump in too, I think what's also important are stories of success. So examples where you've taken action and something has worked. I think those are things that also inspire a lot of confidence that this is something that we can accomplish, that it's not hopeless. So I think the stories of success, super critical. Matching the scope of the problem to the scope of the solutions is also really important. I think people have struggled for a long time understanding why turning their light bulbs off was going to help polar bears. But you also, there's sort of a tension there, because you also have to give them an action that they feel that they can accomplish as well. So you can't go to a school group and talk about policy change, right? So there's got to be sort of this balance between helping people see a path forward for themselves, because people always ask, what can I do? And helping them see how that connects to what can we do at a scale that's going to make a significant difference.
Yeah. Oh, that's important. Yeah, definitely. We got a couple of questions in the chat, and I want to go ahead and get to those. We could go in a lot of different directions. I love talking to the three of you, but Zach asks about, I think he's specifically talking about gloom and doom in the media. And maybe you've all, Maggie, you've as a former journalist, and then your current job, and then me, Jim, you both spoken with journalists. What Zach is getting at is that in sort of traditional media, we see a lot of gloom and doom stories. Why is that? Why is there sort of a focus on doom and gloom? And when you're encountering journalists, is that where they're going with the story, or is that just the story they are receiving typically from scientists?
You want me to start with that one?
Oh, sure. Go ahead, Maggie.
I think, it's about journalism now, and it's gotten more so, is about engaging people, grabbing people. And I'm sorry, but bad news sells. It's really, I do think, though, that the society, people are getting overwhelmed by it, and it's actually backfiring because people are tuning it out because they're feeling it. I can't do anything about this. I don't want to hear about this. It's too depressing. And so I think that we're going to see some things come full circle, but the media has always been about the soundbite and the what's sexy, what's going to sell papers, what's going to make headlines, what's going to get me that Pulitzer Prize. And so they're going to continue to do that. And I think scientists have an obligation of giving them facts and trying to ground them in what is the truth. And it's a struggle when you present to when you work with a reporter. There's lots of good ones, but there's lots that are out there just trying to make a name for themselves. And so you have to go into an interview really prepared. I think Mead's point that she doesn't go into one ever that she hasn't thought about ahead of time. And if it's going to be something controversial, you want to do your homework. We have this prep that we do with our scientists called a murder board, and we sit down with them and we hammer them with every potential controversial question they could get asked so that they don't feel caught off guard or defensive when they're in that interview, and they can answer the question honestly without getting their back up and looking defensive.
Yeah, I love the idea of the murder board.
So it may feed into that doom and gloom a little bit, but yeah, it's, that skill of pivoting is so critical, right? To be able to take the question and be able to turn it towards what you want to talk about, because, like you said, May, if it bleeds, it leads, right? That's the whole thing. So they're looking for something that's scary, and that's, that crisis narrative. But we also know that the crisis narrative is not effective for getting people to take action on things. It gets, like, just as you said, makes people shut down, makes people feel hopeless. And so, hope-based narratives are much more effective, but they're not necessarily compatible with what makes a exciting headline.
Yeah, that's a great point. Forrest, I see you have your hand up. You want to go ahead and ask a question?
Yeah, I had a question for Mead. So we've sort of been discussing the role of science in policymaking this week, and that was something that you mentioned in a paper on transforming science training. And I'm just wondering if you see that approach changing, like, on a wider scale.
I love that you are aware of this paper, Forrest. It's nice to know someone is reading these papers. Yeah, so we recently published a paper on the need to transform science training so that academia is producing scientists who are able to work effectively with policymakers and in the way that we need to, at the scale that we need to address the environmental challenges that we're facing. And so some of the things in that paper were about things like training scientists, not just in science and their discipline, but also in collaborative research skills and communication and all these things. And also the need for shifts in the attitudes and behaviors in academia of valuing other forms of knowledge and valuing work outside the academy. And so if you're asking if these things are changing, I would say, I guess I'm in a little bit of a bubble because I actually run a program to train graduate students in these skills. So we have the Northwest Climate Adaptation Science Center has a graduate and postdoctoral research fellowship program where it's like a 1-year intensive. We fund the research, but that's like the carrot. But then they also then have to go to like a winter seminar that we offer at UW on linking science and practice and science and action. And it's all about the theory and practice of how to step outside of science and work with decision makers. And we have cohort calls and we do a lot of different stuff with them. They get on the ground training and doing this. So from where I'm sitting, this is the kind of thing we're offering because I never had that as a graduate student. I learned how to do this like as I was doing it. And so we have that here at UW, but we offer it to a whole bunch of schools in the Northwest. And I know we're not the only kind of fellowship or program doing that. So I do think it's changing. And I see a lot of the demand coming from the graduate students, but also earlier career faculty. They get that too, I think, much more than in the past. When I was in college, I remember even then sensing I was like in a basic ecology and evolutionary biology program. And I remember sensing then the sort of, I don't want to say disdain, but you could tell that like there was, the Department of Natural Resources on campus, like the applied work, that somehow wasn't as high status or something as doing basic science. I think those attitudes are changing. I think they really are, because the challenges are so great. And the funding is changing too. There's more and more funding for doing this kind of applied work and decision relevant work. So I see it changing. It's not changing enough, but it is changing.
Great. Maggie, do you have something to add?
I do, because I'd just like to say that it's interesting to hear that because I feel like to make a plug for the government, we at Alaska Fisheries Science Center, I'm fortunate to work for leaders that really value communications and see the importance of training staff and having a strong communications program. But it's going beyond just working and learning how to communicate effectively. It's learning how to work effectively and engage with our constituents, in this case, Alaska Native communities. And I've had tremendous support to bring in trainers to do cultural diversity training and help people understand how the differences in our culture and working, and how when we communicate with Alaska Native communities, even the way we all process information is very, very different. And the cadence is different. And so it's been really interesting to see our scientists get really enthusiastic about participating in this. So there is a groundswell internally too among staff wanting to do better at communicating and working with our constituents and communicating with more diverse audiences.
That's great. That's really interesting to hear. And actually, since Maggie, you both mentioned this idea of co-creation in your introduction. That sort of ties into something that we've been talking about recently, which is the idea of sort of authority order when it comes to science communication, that we listen to experts and that they are the sources of knowledge and the rest of us should just pay attention. But that excludes many voices in a conversation. And I'm just wondering, for all three of you, have you seen this conversation shift over time from one of scientists as the authority and authority order to trying to make science more inclusive? And what do you see as sort of advantages and disadvantages in that? Or I should say barriers and opportunities.
I think, I guess I think we're at the start of it. I think we are, we have a long way to go, but I do think that because, like I said, we're doing this cultural awareness training and how to understand Indigenous cultures in Alaska, and that staff are open to hearing it. And there's a lot of, negative information that's presented. I mean, the federal government, the role of the federal government in Alaska historically is not good, and the treatment of Alaska Native people. And they came in and they gave a presentation that was really intense to get us on a level playing field. And the reaction, I was surprised at the reaction of staff, because they just wanted to know more. And how do we move beyond this? How do we improve our working relationship? How do we learn how to respect your point of view and realize that you're bringing information to the table that's equal to the science? I mean, we're not out on the water every day like you are, just like the fishing industry as well. They're out there every day. They have that year-round perspective. We have a short-term perspective doing our research projects. And I think slowly I'm starting to see this change, this sea change at the center, where people are starting to really want to engage more and bring that traditional knowledge into our science. We do ecosystem status reports, and we're collecting information from the communities, but it's challenging because we want to respect their information and not use it inappropriately. So it's a challenge of how to integrate it in a respectful way. So I think we're at the beginning of this, but I think there's going to be a lot more openness to other perspectives as we move forward.
I might add quickly to that one of the best ways to make sure that you don't inappropriately integrate traditional or Indigenous knowledge or local knowledge into your work is to work with Indigenous peoples and local communities in doing your work, and in a way it's done in a way and facilitated in a way that everyone has equal power in that relationship and in doing that work. I just know from experience, I will get it wrong if I try to incorporate other forms of knowing in my work without working with the people who have generated that, and working with the folks who we hope will use the information that we produce. So when we talk about co-creation or co-production of knowledge or transdisciplinary research, there's a lot of different ways of talking about it, but the premise of all of that is that we are going to do a better job if we work together throughout the whole process. Whereas most of us were trained as scientists that I get an idea, I do my science, I publish my paper, and then I just leave that paper on like a loading dock and expect people to come by and pick it up and use it. And I'm just telling you that is not what's going to happen. So you got to, it's much more likely to be used if you co-create that stuff with the people who you intend to use it, because then they own it at the end of it. They're much more likely to use something that they were involved in creating and that it actually reflects their decision-making context and their knowledge. And that you don't just produce a paper, but also you probably are going to do all kinds of other things like webinars and press releases. And so it's just that model for how we do science as this like unidirectional, unilateral, like solo genius science, scientists doing the work alone is not where things are headed at all.
Yeah.
And I think, if we're thinking about like the metaphor of a pendulum, that it's swinging towards being more inclusive, that I think sometimes this conversation ends up with somebody grabbing that pendulum and then swinging it around and hitting people with it, because it's not where we're going is not to where every kind of, knowledge is the same and it's all equally valuable. It's that we need to recognize expertise comes in many forms and that Western science is not the only kind of expertise, but your 100 hours on YouTube is not research. And so it's recognizing that somebody brings a knowledge base from a traditional ecologist perspective or a fisher's experience in the ocean. I mean, these are incredibly valuable sources of expertise. But we still need to value expertise and recognize it, and I think make good decisions based on expertise. And I think we're struggling with that right now.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. It's an interesting thing to bring up. I think one of the three of you mentioned this idea of trust and credibility. I think maybe it was me. You mentioned this earlier, and this is something that we've been talking about in class a bit as well. And one of the things that came up is advocacy, and when scientists take position of advocacy. And in fact, I'm going to launch a poll question really quick, because this is sort of a thing we do within the class. I'm going to ask our students a question about what their perception of students is or of scientists when they take positions of advocacy for policy or action, and if it affects their trustworthiness or their credibility. And then I want to get your perspectives, as people who find themselves communicating science, but oftentimes communicating science in a way that advocates for particular actions or positions. And are there concerns? Do you ever feel concerns about your credibility or trustworthiness, or have other scientists expressed those concerns that you've talked to? Please, anyone.
I guess since you mentioned me first, I might go. And I might also say that it helps that there's some research on this too. So actually a paper just came out that was noting that it's actually a particularly American concern among scientists that advocacy undermines credibility. And in fact, that's much less of a concern of scientists in Europe, for example. I don't know if they looked elsewhere, but I know they looked there. And in fact, when they did polls of the public, they did surveys, they found that advocacy on the part of scientists actually did not at all affect their trustworthiness, but it might have affected their perception of objectivity. So that we're expected, people know we're human beings. They know that we have opinions about things. And so we're not fooling anybody by saying like, I am science robot, like I have no feelings or opinions about anything. People know we do. So it's just being transparent about it. And I would say as far as like personally, I think I've just had the increasing awareness that my silence on political issues serves only like systems of oppression. I mean, it's not serving justice for me to be apolitical. No one's apolitical, right? And so if I sit things out, particularly around inclusion or environmental justice or climate justice, if I sit out on these things, it's not doing what we think it's going to do, which is, it's only serving injustice. And so I personally feel very comfortable in my integrity if I do say something, and I'm much less concerned about my credibility than my integrity. I don't know, you would think those would be the same things, but maybe the perception of my credibility is less important to me than my own sense of integrity. And so I am much less concerned, and I'm much less concerned over the last several years than I was before that. And I tend to see this shifting in general in science. Like I tend to see among more early career scientists, and particularly among students, much more comfort with advocacy. And especially as the challenges become greater and greater, who does it serve for me to sit out and not say that we should be taking action on climate change? That I feel totally comfortable saying that. So.
Yeah, we're a scientific advocacy organization. So, and when we made that transition, we lost some supporters. Some folks that said we used to like it when you were more like Switzerland. But I think this idea that you somehow bring the information and then set it in front of people and let them make their own decision is a straw argument. It's because you decide what information that you bring to people. You decide the questions that you ask. You decide the way that it's presented. So it's more honest to come to people and say, this is what the science supports, and these are some actions that we think are important, because it's, yeah, like what Mead was saying, I don't think that you're serving some higher purpose by pretending that you don't have an opinion, or that there's not a direction that serves society to, when it comes to decision making.
Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. Maggie, I'm going to put you on the spot only for a moment, because obviously you're in sort of a very different position in that, you're a government organization. So how when you're talking with scientists and you're communicating their work, what is there a conversation about advocacy at all? If the conversations don't have the conversation, it's like Fight Club. We just don't talk about it.
No, I mean, this is a tough thing working in the federal government. We are, we provide data, and we have a mandate to collect information to understand stock status and manage fish stocks. And this is where I get a little divided. We have a science center where I work, and we have the regulatory side of the house. The regulatory side of the house, they do take positions. They do make recommendations. They do actually implement management measures. But the way the in fisheries, it's a kind of a bottom-up approach. The Magnuson-Stevens Act, the Fishery Management Council, which has a bunch of different stakeholders on it, fishing industry reps, state representatives, a representative from NOAA, they actually set the management recommendations, and then that has to be approved by the Department of Commerce. But the regional office, our management arm, does provide guidance on what is a preferred recommendation for management action. The Science Center is supposed to be somewhat neutral. We are supposed to be providing what we know about stock status and letting others make allocation decisions or implement the management measures based on, the best available science. That doesn't mean that our scientists don't put out papers and take positions in those papers, but they have to acknowledge that that's their personal opinion. As a federal government agency, we are supposed to be somewhat neutral. We are supposed to provide information that NGOs can use, the Alaska Native community can use, that the fishing industry can use, and we are not supposed to be taking any sides. That's the challenge we face. But you're right, we're human, and our scientists do have agendas. They do have points of view and positions, but we try to keep it as grounded in what we know and not speculate. And that's probably where we get a little away from, or that's how we try to keep people from advocacy, I guess. But I think they do. I mean, they have the right to advocate for a position, but again, they can't represent NOAA fisheries if they do.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I always find it fascinating to think about how that line is walked. I mean, full disclosure, Maggie, you know my wife, who is a federal scientist, and we had this conversation a lot. Well, here's a question that is Connor asked, and it's geared, it's aimed at Jim, but I kind of want to expand it out, and it's about events, environmental events or conservation events. In this case, Shark Week in particular. Connor asked a question about how important these events like Shark Week are to communicating science and sparking further interest in science and the environment. And is it sort of a double-edged sword? Is it great to get people engaged, but are there traps and pitfalls to things like Shark Week? Jim.
Shark Week. Yeah, I mean, it's, folks have a love-hate relationship with Shark Week, right? I mean, if you ask, is it important? I think it's incredibly important. There's no bigger conversation about the ocean that happens all year long. I mean, the audience of people who are available to you to talk about shark conservation is staggering. I've been on a couple of programs, and every time I've had an opportunity to talk to 5 million people at a time, and you just don't have that kind of platform otherwise. And the way that they approach many things on Shark Week are damaging. The way that they use faux drama narratives, the way that they use music, the overemphasis and is just talking too much about shark attacks. I mean, all of those things are significant negatives. But I saw someone else mention Jaws as well, and often people look at Jaws and say, "What a horrible thing for sharks." But for every person that you can show me who is terrified to go in the water because of Jaws, I can show you a scientist who was inspired to study sharks or save them because of Jaws. So it's that Shark Week and Jaws, that phenomenon, it creates interest. It creates, strong feelings about sharks. And even if a person's value of sharks is that it's a big, cool, scary monster, they still want the big, cool, scary monsters around. So I just think that it's incredibly valuable, and we need to work towards making it better, because it's just the rationale for Shark Week has always been, and we've had these conversations with producers and companies that produce these programs, is that we have to go with this because this is what sells. But it's a false narrative, because it doesn't mean that it's the only thing that could sell, because there have been programs on Shark Week that are not fear-based, that are based on wonder and conservation, and they are just as popular as the other ones, but they're so small in number that it's not enough evidence for Discovery to say, let's change our whole approach. It works, and so they want to stick with what works. But it's just has so much potential that it's worth fighting for, in my opinion.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, I'm still waiting for the Megalodon mermaid crossover. Well, so Maggie, sort of asked you sort of a similar question. What about shows like The Deadliest Catch? Are those in your mind good or helpful in sort of getting people thinking and talking about fisheries like in Alaska?
Yeah, I actually think so. And I mean, also Shark Week. No, it does Shark Week now. We do a Shark Week because it's an opportunity to present information that's fact-based and not as dramatic, and piggyback off of something that's hugely successful. And I think, we were approached by the Jeremy Wade team. They do river monsters. I don't know if you guys are familiar with river monsters, but it's the same kind of thing. And they wanted us to be on because they were coming to Alaska and they wanted to know a scientist. And we're like, oh, no way. We're not getting involved in this. You're too out there. You're too sensationalist. And we had many discussions that they would be very respectful of our science, and they'd give us an opportunity to present the science in a respectful way. And we decided to take the risk, and we did it. And it went really well. But I think you got to look at these, things are going to grab people. And, younger kids, they like, our most successful social media was a dissection of a fish. I mean, people want to see gross things. And so you got to take advantage of that and use it as an opportunity, as a stepping off point to educate them.
Great. That's really interesting. Okay, so Mead, to you, what about Climate Week? Would you go for that if we had Climate Week on Discovery?
Sure. I mean,
Too scary.
Maybe so.
yeah, I'm imagining like, what was that movie? The Day After Tomorrow.
Oh, Day After Tomorrow. Yeah.
Yeah, right. I'm imagining like the most sensational climate fiction ever. But engagement is engagement. I guess I would love to see any increase in climate coverage that would spark conversation is really important, because we know from these wonderful surveys that the Yale program on climate communication has been doing for years, we know that Americans are super concerned about climate change, a much larger percentage than you would think based on what you might see in the media. Much larger percentage of Americans are concerned about climate change than those that dismiss it, which are actually a very small percentage of Americans actively dismiss climate change. But we also know that people don't talk about it. So that's a real problem. We need people to be talking about climate change, talking about why it matters to them, why they care, because that's what leads to action. And so if our Climate Week on Discovery Channel is what gets people doing that, as sensational as it might be, I think that would be a net benefit. So now I'm imagining like what they would do, but still, I think it would be a net benefit.
All right. I appreciate that. I mean, it's sort of an interesting thing to think about. Probably not going to happen anytime soon, but I can pursue some producers on that one. Well, y'all, I want to be respectful of your time and the time of our audience, and realize that we're already at a little over 5:30. One thing that I usually start these sessions with is a comment about the land, and I want to go ahead and end with that, because we didn't have a chance at the beginning. And so I'd like to end by saying the University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. While we meet today here in a virtual platform, or while we have met in a virtual platform, I'd like to take a moment just to acknowledge the importance of the lands which we all call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to improving relationships between nations and improving our understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. And I just want to make sure that I had a chance to say that. But I want to thank each of you for being here with us today. As always, I really love talking to you all, and I apologize for the little snafu we had with the technical material. But let's give them a big round of applause, y'all. Everybody's on the Zoom, please. Big round of applause. For those of you joining us from YouTube, I just want to mention that this will be our last Conversations in Environmental Communications that we'll be broadcasting live. We'll be doing a private session next week, but please stay tuned. We have a new seminar series coming during spring quarter called Fashionably Sustainable. It's going to be about sustainability in the fashion and apparel industry. It's going to be very interesting, I think. So stay tuned for that. We'll have a schedule online very soon.